Good evening, students. This evening we will be discussing the many causes of the American Civil War. Generally speaking, the ineffectiveness of the U.S. government in the years between 1836 and 1860 led directly to the Civil War. America was rapidly spreading west, and no president could or would effectively deal with the issue of slavery. This evening, we will be discussing the few polarizing events that led directly to the Civil War. What I'd like you to do is define each one of these events in your vocabulary section, and for each, include its cause and effect relationship with the other events surrounding it. Thank you very much. The events are as follows: Manifest Destiny, the American Progress Picture, the Missouri Compromise, the Wilmot Proviso, the idea of popular sovereignty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, the KansasNebraska Act / Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott case, and the election of 1860. For Bleeding Kansas and the KansasNebraska Act, please define each one separately. Thank you very much. The first term that we will be discussing is Manifest Destiny. This term was coined by a newspaper editor named John O'Sullivan in 1845, and he said, "It is the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federative development of self-government." He goes on to say that it is a myth entrusted to us. It is the right such as that of the tree to fill the space of the air, and that the earth suitable for the full expansion of its principles and destiny of growth, of the West as a land of romance and adventure emerged. Now, what this essentially means is that the United States would use its resources and military strength to conquer all of the land on the American continent below Canada in the name of democracy. We wanted to see the borders of the United States shine from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, and it did not matter what countries were in our way or what people or natives were in our way. We would overspread the entire American continent. As is predictable, this would cause conflict with Native Americans and the Mexican government. Now, the next term is actually a painting, and it's called American Progress by John Gast, and it was painted in 1872. I'm aware that it is after the Civil War. However, it is a very important piece to explain what Manifest Destiny was like. In your vocabulary section, what I'd like you to do is to write down all of the things, all the imagery that you see in this painting and what you think it describes. The figure at the center of the painting is named Columbia. She's the mythical angel and protector of the United States. As you can see, her face is pointed west with a glowing sunlight on her face. She is carrying two things. One in her right hand is a book of education and a spool of wire. Her left is trailing the wire behind her. This wire is telegraph wire. You can see it linked up to the telegraph poles behind her, essentially connecting communication from the East Coast to the West. Just out in front of her, blazing a trail, is the pioneers in a covered wagon, right center in the picture, and right in the forefront of the picture is mountain men and miners who are pushing ahead of American civilization. But behind her, we see a Wells Fargo stagecoach, and we see 3 railroads, and we also see farmers tilling the land. Running away from her, we see Native American tribes, wildlife as depicted by the bear and the buffaloes, and we also see the darkness sort of fleeing from her as she floats along, bringing the light civilization of the East Coast out west. This is just a small amount of the imagery and symbolism in this painting. We will discuss much more of it tomorrow in class. The Missouri Compromise was the political action that kicked off Manifest Destiny in westward expansion. Essentially, it was the attempt to organize the Louisiana Purchase and to create states out of it. Missouri would be the second state created west of the Mississippi River. Now, Missouri wanted to join the Union as a slave state. However, this would upset the balance of slave and free. So, in order to come up with a compromise, the legislature would carve out a new state out of what used to be Massachusetts and create Maine. Now, this would maintain the balance. Now, the only question remained would be what to do with the rest of the unorganized territory. So, the legislature came up with an idea. All land above 36 degrees 30 parallel would be closed to slavery. All land below it would be open to slavery. As you can see, this created a problem. Slavery had no room to expand. This would foreshadow our eventual conquering of not only Texas, but the rest of the southwestern parts of the United States in order to make room for the expansion of slavery. Now, very quickly, nobody was happy with the idea of the Missouri Compromise because it essentially allowed for enough ambiguity that slavery could be extended, and unfortunately it also did not allow for the people to decide whether they would like slavery or not. So two other ideas were floated out there to solve this issue. One was popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty meant that people should be able to decide whether their state was going to be a slave or a free labor state, not the Missouri Compromise. The other was the Wilmot Proviso. This was put forth by a congressman by the name of David Wilmot, and it declared that slavery should not exist in the West at all. Now, with a want to expand west and a need to expand west, the United States decided to go to war with Mexico. And in this war, which many people felt was an aggressive war, the United States was successful. Now, the end of the war was something called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And essentially, the United States had Mexico at its mercy. So instead of taking all of Mexico, the United States decided that it would settle for the northern half. And it would receive all of northern Mexico in return for $15 million payment. Because the United States took nothing by force, we paid for what we took. Now, California on the West Coast immediately would apply for statehood after seeing a gold rush. Now, in one foul swoop and in one treaty, Manifest Destiny would be complete. Slave states would now have equal territory to expand in the South. However, California wanted to be a free state regardless of its geographical boundaries, even though half of California is below the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel that was called for within the Missouri Compromise. So the question is, how did California get enough population to apply for statehood upon becoming an American territory? And the answer was the gold rush. In 1848, gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevada foothills just east of Sutter's Fort, which is modern-day Sacramento. It was discovered in a sawmill owned by a Swedish immigrant by the name of John Sutter in modern-day Coloma, California, in the American River. Now, as word got out that gold was discovered and that was ripe for the picking, hundreds of thousands of people from all around the world rushed to California to get rich. Miners came overland across the United States. They came by boat, where they crossed the Panama Isthmus, and they also came from the east, traveling across the Pacific Ocean from places such as China and Australia. Few people would become rich from actually mining gold. But the biggest effect of the gold rush is that villages, such as the village of Yerba Buena, would blossom into cities like San Francisco. And California would have such a large influx of a population that by 1850 it had more than enough to apply for statehood. Now, Mr. Wilson has some very close ties to this idea of the gold rush. And if you look to the picture on the bottom left, that is a picture of Mr. Wilson's parents' house, which was built in 1870 in the town of Benicia, California, which was the third capital of California in the year 1851. And obviously, the picture on the top is a picture of Frank Gore on the San Francisco 49ers, Mr. Wilson's favorite football team. While California had more than enough population to become a state, we had to figure out whether it would be a free state or a slave state. California knew that it did not want to have slaves. However, this issue would be challenged in the Senate. The famous Henry Clay, senator from Kentucky, would come up with another compromise that would allow California to become a free state. And it would be as follows. First, California entered the Union as a free state. The rest of the Mexican cession, or the territory that we got from the Mexican-American War, would be decided by popular sovereignty, meaning they would vote on whether to be free or slave, and there would be a Fugitive Slave Act that would be instituted in all free states. Now we're going to talk more about the Fugitive Slave Act on its own because it is very important. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act, part of the Compromise of 1850, essentially allowed slave owners to go into free territory to reclaim their property. Now, this is in the United States Constitution, but it went further than that. They would also be allowed to go into free territory with slaves and live for brief periods of time. This allowed slave owners to go to California and have their slaves mine gold for them while they sat on riverbanks and drank lemonade. This challenged the idea that there were actually free states, because if you could have a slave owner move into a free territory with slaves, even though slavery would be outlawed, well, where did the line stop with slavery? This would embolden pro-slave advocates essentially to bring their slaves to free territories. Now, the next issue in the saga around slavery would have to do with the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, hence known as the KansasNebraska Act. Essentially, the rest of the Louisiana Purchase was still unorganized, and so they decided that it was time to come up with a organizational method for them. And so this was put forth by an Illinois senator by the name of Stephen Douglas, and it divided the remaining territory into two territories, one in the south called the Kansas Territory, and the other in the north called the Nebraska Territory. It was decided that popular sovereignty would decide the issue of slavery in each of these territories. This effectively eliminated the Missouri Compromise once and for good, and deciding on what they considered a more democratic fashion of deciding the question of slavery. By looking at the map here, we see that the Nebraska Territory was much larger, containing the states of Montana, parts of North and South Dakota, Nebraska, and parts of Utah and Colorado, where the Kansas Territory, essentially just containing Kansas and Colorado, was much smaller in the south. Now, with popular sovereignty firmly in place, the next place to apply for statehood would be the state of Kansas. The state would be flooded with both pro-slave and abolitionist groups in order to influence the election. Now, violence would obviously break out between these two groups, each vying for a majority in the vote over slavery. Residents of Kansas oftentimes felt that they were having slavery being shoved down their throat by out-of-state people from surrounding slave states such as Missouri and Tennessee. Pro-slavery groups would destroy the city of Lawrence, Kansas, and an abolitionist by the name of John Brown and his sons would behead pro-slavery raiders at a place called Pottawatomie Creek, when it would be forever known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. Brown and his sons, believing they were on a mission from God, would use broadswords to decapitate 5 pro-slave raiders. Eventually, Kansas would be admitted into the Union as a free state. However, the bleeding and fighting would last for upwards of 2 years. Now on to civil rights and something called the Dred Scott case. Now Dred Scott was a slave who was taken with his master into free territories, both living in Illinois and Wisconsin. Now after his owner died, Scott decided that he would sue for freedom. The first case was heard in a lower court in 1846, but after appeals were made, it was finally heard by the Supreme Court in 1857. Now, what the ruling found was a blow to the civil rights of all slaves in the United States. It said that despite Scott living in a free state, that he was not free because slaves were not citizens and therefore they could not sue in court, period. It essentially took away the humanity of the slave, and it demonstrated that American thoughts about slaves were essentially that they were less than people. Now this brings us to the election of 1860. The United States suffered from a distinct lack in leadership in the years between 1836 and 1860. In the years between 1789 and 1836, the United States had 7 presidents. That's 48 years and 7 presidents, all serving 2 terms with the exception of the father and son team of Adams. In the years after Andrew Jackson, 1836 to 1860, the United States would go through 8 presidents, no president serving longer than 4 years, and 2 presidents dying in office. This lack of leadership allowed for the United States to essentially get out of control. This brings us to the election of 1860 and the new party of the Republicans. Now, the Republicans were formed for the election of 1856, however, did not make a large push towards the presidency. But their new candidate, Abraham Lincoln, was seen as widely popular in the northern states. The Democratic Party that was founded by Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren would be split in 2 between a northern Democratic Party and a southern Democratic, more pro-slave party. Hence, we have 2 Democrats running for the presidency in John Breckinridge and Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas running in the north, Breckinridge running for the south. Lastly, we had John Bell running as something called a constitutional unionist party. His main goal was to keep the United States government together. Now, when the dust settled after the election, Abraham Lincoln would walk away with the presidency with the majority of the electoral votes without winning a single vote in a single slave state. And in fact, because of his general anti-slavery beliefs, he did not appear on the ballot in many states such as Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. Many slave states saw this as a fact that a candidate could be elected with no slave support, proved in their mind that a conspiracy loomed that would doom them to economic servitude to the North, and this was the last straw to many of them to leave the country for good. Thank you for listening this evening. We will discuss this in much more depth as we go on, breaking down each part of this lecture into different lessons. Thank you and good night.